I'm going to start. Welcome to my lecture recital. Thank you for taking time and joining me during this performance. Um, it is my hope, and it was my goal through my research and my um, kind of study of this music to put into context the purpose of my performing. Uh, Having now done two different um, degrees in performance, I thought that would be a very valuable insight to kind of share. Um, and I hope that you are able to take away something from this performance of these six pieces that will that I programmed today, um, and just have that guide some sort of meaning to this performance. So I'm going to begin, and yeah, enjoy. So, for the last 6.5 years of familiarizing myself with classical piano repertoire, learning the repertoire, and then performing the repertoire, I have consistently questioned the purposes of performing the music that is etched into the classical piano canon. While oftentimes I found pleasure in the process of performing this repertoire and recognized that this process has helped my growth as a pianist, I have struggled with finding purpose outside of gaining the technical facility needed to perform the music. In 2018, I posted on my social media account contemplating the purpose of performing. Um, is it the is the performance for the performer to express their own interpretation of the music being performed? Is it for the purpose of expressing strictly what the composer's intents are, or is it for the audience to gain something through the experience of the performance? While these questions and points are part of a lengthy, very lengthy philosophical set of conversations that a performer must have with themselves, um, they are not necessarily the point of this lecture. Instead, these questions are what led me to find a passion with repertoire that allows all three of these questions to be a meaningful part of the performance process. The pieces in the set presented are creative and ambiguous, allowing for a personal exploration of the music, of musical and extra musical principles. This repertoire demonstrates a connection that music has with language that is not as direct as a setting for solo voice or a choral setting. The repertoire selections that I will be presenting in this lecture recital are poems for piano. The concept for this short program of solo piano repertoire is based around the sets of piano miniatures by Vincent Persichetti titled Poems for Piano. While the program only consists of two poems for piano by Persichetti, the entire program was inspired by the use of text, in particular a poetic text, by the composer in order to create extra musical purpose in the performance of the repertoire. These poetic texts are presented in different ways by each composer, but all provide enough contextual purpose to the music in order for there to be something poetic in nature produced by the musical performance. The labeling of poems for piano being a type of subgenre of piano miniatures, something short enough to not lose an audience's attention, but long enough to say something, is an idea supported by Edmund Kovalevsky's description of his aims in poetry, which elaborates on Edgar Allan Poe's peculiar paradox that a long poem does not exist, and that there must be a steady pressing down of the stamp upon the wax. Since I'm labeling all of these pieces of music in the program as poems for piano, creating a sort of subgenre as a result, it is important to define what poems for piano are and how the pieces chosen fit into the category. This process of defining something new is, of course, open ended and up for personal interpretation, which is sort of the entire point when talking about a concept like poetry. The process started with the question, what is a poem for piano? This question seemed easy enough to answer when it arose, but very quickly I could realize I could only define for piano, which just states that the composition is to be played on the piano. This led to the shortening of the question in order to understand the purpose in the now labeled subgenre. What is a poem? Mark Yakic, a professor of writing at Loyola University, had the same question and published an article on The Atlantic website titled, What is a Poem?, in which he defines the origins of the word being the Greek word poema, meaning thing made. This is interesting now, as there is a parallel to music. A poem is to poetry what a musical score is to music. A poem and a musical score are just things, words on a page or musical symbols on a page, that are organized in a way that, when read properly, produce poetry and music respectively. Now there's a shift again in the question from what is a poem to what is poetry, because the focus shifts on what is on the page to what the information on the page means. This is the transformation seen in another article titled What is a Poem by Brett Bourbon. While the title poses the question about a poem, Bourbon often talks about what poetry is. Near the end of his article, he attempts to answer the question by referencing thoughts of poet Ralph Waldo Emerson. Bourbon states, "But if we see poetry as a mode of thinking or understanding or seeing, then we might agree with Ralph Waldo Emerson that poetry is a form of symbolism." This reference to Emerson comes from Emerson's essay titled The Poet, from his essay series 2, where he writes, "The use of symbols has a certain power of emancipation and exhilaration for all men, all people." Edmund Kovalevsky writes a half-century later, "Poetry as a fine art must be purged of its mere material grandeur, so that its few consummate miracles may come to light." Both poets describe poems as something material that, when contextualized, produce something more powerful than the words themselves produce, something synergetic. Therefore, musical symbols in a musical score, when contextualized, are able to produce this synergy as well. With the synergy that poetry creates based off a grouping of simple words, why can't something more concrete and simple, such as a straightforward, "I am walking through the forest" statement, create the exhilaration that Emerson writes about, or allows miracles to come to light, as Kovalevsky discusses? Why is poetry an important and fascinating art? Mark Yakic says because poetry is ambiguous. Not only is the meaning ambiguous, but sometimes there can even be ambiguity and argument over if a poem is indeed a poem. Yakic writes, "The most productive thing about trying to define a poem through comparison is not in the comparison itself, but in the arguing over it." These arguments and discussions about poetry are important because it emphasizes that meaning is created by the reader and that meaning is unique only to them. Poetry helps to rearrange familiar words, sentences, and even basic symbols of life to create this meaning. Yakic continues his discussions about the purposes of poetry by saying, "A poem helps the mind play with its well-trod patterns of thought and can even help reroute those patterns by making us see the familiar anew." An example of this process is in a poem by Aram Saroyan. One of his many unique poems is one word, light. This one word is meant to highlight the fact that in the word light, the GH is silent by adding another silent GH to the middle of the word. So it's Lighght. Soroyan describes the purpose of this edition by saying, the crux of the poem is to try to make the ineffable, which is light, which we only know about because it illuminates something else, into a thing. He made a familiar word, something new. He made it into a thing, which was the definition of a poem. And the extra GH in the poem makes it poetic. With this sort of basic understanding of what poetry is and then a way to define what a poem is, the answer for the original question of what is a poem for piano is now a little clearer. A poem for piano is a musical composition, a thing, which is a form of symbolism that is a mode for thinking, understanding, or seeing. These symbols, whether they are visual musical symbols on the musical score, or aural symbols, which are how the parameters of music sound, have a certain power of emancipation and exhilaration for all by helping to reroute well-trod patterns of thought by making us see the familiar anew. But doesn't music as an independent subject already display these kinds of principles? Music already acts as a freeing mode of expression and understanding. Edmund Kovalevsky spoke about this in his dedicatory note to famed conductor Leopold Stokowski in his collection of poems titled Deaf Walls, saying, "For it is in the shock of the transition from the real to the imagined, with the new and fatal beauty born of the terror thereof, that the true power of the poet is most keenly realized, compelling him to create out of his own need the myth of a new and more gratifying life, of his own imagining. A power hitherto realized for the most part only in music. Music in this sense being the truest form of art as a literal creating out of nothing of something altogether new, a giving to the world of something it hasn't got." Similarly, Mark Yakic writes in the same article mentioned before, "But seriously, isn't a poem a home for deep feelings, stunning images, beautiful lyricism, tender reflections, and our biting wit?" I suppose so, but again, other arts or technologies seem better at these jobs. Novels offer us real or imaginary worlds to explore or escape to. Tweets offer us poignant epigrams. Painting and design offer us eye candy, and music, well, face it, poetry has never been able to compete with that sublime combo of lyrics, instruments, and melody. With these two quotes referring to the innate poetry already created in music, why then add poetic text to the instrumental music? Why have poems for piano? Listen to this first musical excerpt from a Chopin etude. Experienced pianists know that there is a given title to this etude. It's the Bees Etude. It is likely, though, that without knowing that there is a title other than etude, a person in the audience might just take the etude at face value and appreciating it mainly for its virtuosity. As soon as the title is given, there is new meaning for the performer, technically, and to the audience, orally. For this next example, I will play the third movement of Norman Della Gioio's Suite for Piano, but before that, I will read a poem for you. Dawn is coming, time to rest my eyes. If I were to wake up, I would reach my demise. Now, I do have to admit, neither the title of the etude, Bees, or the poem I read before the movement of the suite were used by the composers. The etude is not specifically about bees, nor is the suite about hibernating bears like I just read a poem about by high schoolers I found on the internet. However, when these contexts are given to the pieces, whether or not the given context is part of the composer's intentions, the experience of the performer of the music is changed based on the context given. Therefore, by using the poetic text given by the composer, there can be a unified performance between the composer and performer, and when the poetic text is shared with the audience between the performer and the audience. This communication between composer and audience is the context needed to create a more meaningful performance of the compositions that would otherwise be taken at face value for how they sound or what the reputation of the piece of music is. While this communication is achieved in vocal compositions through the singing of the text, instrumental composers can only provide context if the performer chooses to give the context. Of course, there is the issue of foreign language in vocal music, but the point of having the context of the song being a part of the performance is the key point I am trying to make. This is usually done in program notes, which describe what the performer thinks about the piece or gives matter-of-fact statements about the form or specific figures to be heard in the piece. This context is from a singular point of view and tells the listener how to listen to the piece. However, in the case of these poems for piano, where there is poetic text given by the composers, what if I just read the text or a part of the text, or simply provided nothing but the text in the program notes? Then I allow for the poetic text to give context to the audience's listening experience in a way that is more meaningful to their own perspectives and background on a given subject. In this way, I also keep the poetic text poetic because I am not stating matter-of-factly that this text means one thing or idea. I keep the ambiguity of the text and allow each person, including myself as the performer, to form new ideas around familiar sounds in order to reroute well-trod patterns of thought by making us see the familiar anew. This is the benefit that these pieces provide for a performance. With a sharing of the composer's attached poetic text, the composer's intent for the composition is honored. The performer can have a more meaningful connection to the music through the freedom to interpret the score in a way that does not go against the composer's intentions, and the audience is given better context so that the music being heard will resonate with each individual differently based on their own prior experiences. The first piece on the program is one of Vincent Persichetti poems for piano. I'm refraining from giving the title just yet because this is the first example of why I kept saying poetic texts and not poems. Persichetti wrote 3 sets of poems for piano, based not on an entire poem, like the title suggests. Rather, each piece is based on a singular line of a poem. This specific piece is based on a line from Edmund Kovalevsky's poem titled Change from Deaf Walls. Edmund Kovalevsky was a contemporary of Persichetti in Philadelphia and had a unique connection between his own poetry and music. You see, Kovalevsky organized poems into musical genres. His tone poems, Opus 1, City of New Music, consists of 59 individual poems organized into 2 tone poems. Change is a poem from the first movement of Kovalevsky's Poem Symphony, Opus 2, The Earthly Myth. This connection between poetry and musical genres, specifically instrumental music, is the guiding principle to why I chose to base this entire lecture around Persichetti poems for piano. Before this piece is played, imagine what some of the words in the title might sound like. Then, during the performance, allow your mind to take the sounds that you hear and turn them into thoughts and ideas that are meaningful in your own imagination. Like I mentioned before, prior to the performance of each piece, I will read the title of the piece of music and read the poetic text for which the piece is based on. For the first 2 pieces, the title and the text are one and the same. And warm winds spilled fragrance into her solitudes. The second of the Persichetti pieces is based on a line from a poet more well-known, T.S. Eliot. The line of text comes from his poem titled A Song for Simeon. In this piece, there are many patterns that repeat. Why? What do these repetitions of figures represent in this piece? Again, listen to the words and listen for those words in the music. I have my own ideas and own thoughts about the piece, but I do not want to corrupt the process of creating something new for you as you experience this music for the first time. I only want to give you an inkling of guidance to what the composer wanted to convey through his music. Here's the second piece from Persichetti's Poems for Piano. Dust in sunlight and memory in corners.
She was there.
Oh, it's early 80s?
Yeah, so he's probably 82.
Yeah, I think
No, it's like I'm way older than that now. He wasn't even so old then.
How old is he now?
He's 82 or almost 80. I think he'll be 82.
I thought he would be
this
more. Okay.
Yeah.
Crazy.
But he looks.
kid you're about to hear tonight.
Please mute.
This morning.
Okay.
I did the best I could.
Okay.
These were just to get to
Professor,
this
you are unmuted.
six.
I will play again the Dust in Sunlight and Memory in Corners.
Maybe 5.
Okay.
That'd be great.
Tyler, that chair is in the way. Kind of obstructs your view. That's good.
The 6 Idyls after Goethe by Edward MacDowell are based on different poems by Goethe, who was a classical poet contemporary with Mozart and died even after Beethoven and Schubert in 1832. Many of Goethe's poems are the basis for German Lied throughout the entire Romantic era, such as the famous Erlking. For this particular piano piece, I will read the poem to you in the poetic English translation, keeping the rhyming pattern from the original German text. The one piece of imaginative guidance I give you before I read the poem and then perform this piece is to think about the process of getting up and beginning a long walk through the forest. Here's the poem titled Gefunden by Goethe. Once through the forest, lone I went, to seek for nothing, my thoughts were bent. I saw in the shadow a flower stand there, as stars it glistened, as eyes 'twas fair. I sought to pluck it, it gently said, shall I be gathered only to fade? With all its roots I dug it with care, and took it home to my garden fair. In silent corner soon it was set, there grows it ever, there blooms it yet. Enjoy the performance of Once Through the Forest by Edward MacDowell. I asked you to think about the process of walking. If you thought about it, you would have realized that getting up to the speed and in a consistent stride takes a little bit of time. The beginning of this piece started with a simple repeated figure on a D. In order to show the process of walking and to show the walking throughout the entire piece. What is unique about this repeated figure is that Strauss does something very similar in the beginning of his vocal setting of Gefunden. there is a repeated dominant note, this time on C. That continues throughout much of the song. Both composers are representing the same idea of walking in very similar ways. In her dissertation on Edward MacDowell's poetic voice, Yuchi Sophie Wong states, to MacDowell, structure was not a strict guideline, but merely a means to establish intimate communication with the audience. MacDowell loved to compose this way and sought to communicate his ideas with the audience in this way. The next piece is Brahms's first Ballade from Opus 10. In the score of this piece, the given title of Edward at first looked like a dedicatory note to me. Instead, the Ballade is based on a traditional Scottish ballad titled Edward. Taken at face value, this piece sounds of a beautiful melancholy that has its exclamations of joy throughout. There seems to be a sense of sighing in some of the figures. And the constant shift from minor to major modes creates questions about the story behind the music. This particular story is not that of a sad, melancholy affect. Instead, this traditional Scottish ballad is a murder poem with dialogue between a mother and son. The terrifying reality of the meaning of this piece only sets in after the context is given. The sighing figures turn into pleading from the mother. Edward, Edward. Of course, on E for Edward. And the changes between minor and major modes show an evil, demented shift in character. Allow me to read this murder ballad to you now. Why does your sword so drip with blood, Edward, Edward? Why does your sword so drip with blood, and why so sad you go, oh? Oh, I have killed my hawk so good, mother, mother, I have killed my hawk so good, and I had no other save ye, oh. Your hawk's blood was never so red, Edward, Edward. Your hawk's blood was never so red. My dear son, I tell you, oh. Oh, I have killed my red-roan steed, mother, mother. Oh, I have killed my red-roan steed. That was so fair and free, oh. Your steed was old and you have got more, Edward, Edward. Your steed was old and you have got more. You suffer some other grief, oh. Oh, I have killed my father, dear mother, mother. Oh, I have killed my dear father. Alas, and woe is me, oh. And what penance will you do for that, Edward, Edward? And what penance will you do for that, my dear son? Now tell me, oh. I'll set my foot on yonder ship, mother, mother. I'll set my foot on yonder ship, and I'll fare over the sea, oh. And what will you do with your towers and your hall, Edward, Edward? And what will you do with your towers and your hall that were so fair to see, oh? I'll let them stand till they downfall, mother, mother. I'll let them stand till they downfall, for here nevermore I be, oh. What will you leave to your children and your wife, Edward, Edward? And what will you leave to your children and your wife when you go over the sea, oh? The world's room, let them beg through life, mother, mother. The world's room, let them beg through life. For them I nevermore see. And what will you leave to your own mother, dear Edward, Edward? And what will you leave to your own mother, dear? My dear son, now tell me. The curse of hell you shall get from me, mother, mother. The curse of hell you shall get from me. Such counsel You
Recital.
gate.
That's great, Tyler.
Enjoy this contextualized performance of Brahms's Ballade number 1, titled Edward. This next work comes from Harry Burleigh's only keyboard work, a collection of 6 pieces titled From the Southland. These pieces are all based off one or more African American spiritual, and each has a quote before the piece by Louise Alton Burleigh, the wife of Harry Burleigh. While these quotes are taken from the traditional text of the specific spirituals Harry Burleigh uses, the poetry occurs in the combining of these specific parts of the texts to form a unifying idea. Before the last piece of the set, which I'll be playing today, Louise Alton Burleigh combines the text of My Lord, What a Mornin', and Oh, the Rocks and the Mountains. You'll hear each of the melodies from each spiritual first on their own and then combined throughout the rest of the piece. Harry Burleigh titles this solemn and exclamatory piece, A New Hiding Place. My Lord, what a morning, when the stars begin to fall. The rocks and the mountains shall all flee away, but you shall have a new hiding place that day. The last piece in this program is a piece from Liszt's first of 3 books of piano pieces titled Years of Pilgrimage. Many of the pieces in this first book relate to the novel Obermann by Etienne Pivert de Senancour. This novel is a series of letters by recluse Obermann living in the Swiss mountains. While these letters aren't poems in construction, the language used and the meaning of the letters are very poetic. Liszt attached a part of one of the letters, the 3rd section of the 38th letter of the 6th book, to be precise, to the beginning of this last piece, while also giving the title a poetic title. One that, in conjunction with the letter, allows for many different interpretations of the meaning for the piece. This gives the performer the freedom to interpret the text from the letter and give it its own context. This idea is backed by Liszt himself in a dissertation on Liszt. Sonia Tripathi mentions a quote by the composer saying, "A great idea. The renewal of music by means of an intimate alliance with poetry. A freer development, and so to speak, one more adequate to the spirits of the times." Liszt's purpose for composition was to connect music with poetry and to give context to his music. I want to share with you now the paragraph that I found most profound and meaningful to me. The goal of this piece is to allow for the title, the text, or the combination of the two to create personal meaning for each of you. The paragraph states, "It is in sounds that nature clothes her strongest expressions of the romantic spirit. And it is above all things through the ear that one can convey effectively, and in a few touches, an idea of extraordinary places and things. Sense provoke rapid and overpowering but vague perceptions. What we take in with the eye seems to appeal more to the mind than to the heart. One admires what one sees, but one feels that which one hears. The voice of the woman one loves would seem still more beautiful than her features. The sounds which proceed from beautiful places create a deeper and more lasting impression than their outlines. I've never seen a picture of the Alps which could bring them before me so vividly as a truly alpine melody." This is Liszt's piano piece from his Years of Pilgrimage, Homesick.
Wonderful, Tyler.
I play this particular piece different almost every time, and every time I think about the title or the text or both, it informs my playing differently. This piece truly defines what it means to take familiar sounds, and for me it is in the same pitches and rhythms every time, and contextualizing the poetic text of the title and the letters so that there is new meaning every time. Throughout my time performing classical piano repertoire, I have often thought about the purpose of my performances. I understood that they were for my degree progress and that my technique would improve and that I could share my growth and experiences as a student with my family and friends. However, I still sought to find better meaning to the process, something intrinsic that would drive me to want to continue to explore different perspectives within the music that I had already learned. The three main questions about the performance process, from score study to performance, that I had were, is performance for the purpose of expressing strictly the composer's intent? Is the performance for the performer to express their own interpretations of the music, or is the performance strictly to provide the audience with a collection of sounds organized into music that is pleasing to listen to? As I dove into these questions, the one word that gave meaning to all of these questions was context. Context allows for the composer's intentions to be honored while giving the performer the freedom to create something new for the audience and to experience and create meaning for themselves. Poems for piano are pieces that provide this context through the addition of poetic text attached to musical score. Through the sharing of these poetic texts with the audience, the music the performer creates through the instrument creates poetry. And in this poetry comes new thoughts, ideas, and experiences for all involved in the performance process. In this way, I have found the purpose of my performance. Thank you.
Wonderful.